I think that one of the absolute ballsiest things ArenaNet ever did with Guild Wars 2 back in 2012 was attempt to make 3 games in one. They were already more than familiar with the pain of having too many game types and areas of balance to consider in GW1, but nonetheless they powered on. Because the best MMO wasn't just a PvE game, it was a game with an enormous realm versus realm style content, and it was a game with a competitive arena combat too. PvE, world versus world, and PvP. For years, this was probably one of Guild Wars 2's greatest charms, a real selling point and asset. Yet, for me, as Heart of Thorns has marched onwards and we begin looking at the next big chapter in Guild Wars 2, I can't help but feel like it's become something closer resembling a curse. Because how well have they managed to support 3 game modes at the same time during this expansion? Not well enough, I think. People who enjoy the PvE aspects of this game, the open world and story and slaying of monsters, have had an amazing time. I hopefully don't need to remind you of how utterly incredible the post-release support has been there, with raiding and the return of Living World. But world versus world and PvP don't exactly measure up, at least with regard to where significant developer talent seems to be getting assigned. And the result has been unfortunate, with players of the other game types feeling neglected and disposable, rather than feeling as though Guild Wars 2 is an exceptional, magical game where everyone at all times has 3 amazing different modes of play to try out and continually swap between. Most of the community these days find themselves unbudgingly settled into their 1 or 2 game types and nowhere else. This is probably something that would really irk me as a Guild Wars 2 dev, because really, if people aren't playing Guild Wars 2 to experience a mix of all 3, why go to these efforts in the first place? Why put yourself in the unbelievably difficult position of having to make 3 perfect, thriving games all at once with shared systems that are conflicting with one another for the price of 1? If I wanted to make a competitive game, why wouldn't I make a dedicated competitive game? If I wanted to make a realm v realm experience, then why not dedicate myself to that? And likewise, if I, as a prospective gamer with a weighty wallet, want to play one of those games, why would I choose a hybrid like Guild Wars 2 instead of something to offer a purer experience? The answer can only be that ArenaNet are reaching to the people who like to flip between all of them. And that's probably why we saw Mike O'Brien get so much egg on his face with this gem at a Heart of Thorns event in February of 2015, before he became game director.
How would you base and characterize the participation rates in world versus world among players, especially compared to PvP and PvE? World v world in comparison to these two other niches that Guild Wars 2 has.
It's such a tough question too, because people don't play one thing. People don't go into Guild Wars 2.
Well, there's me. There's people like me.
Do you play one thing?
I do World v World, and that is it.
Okay, well,
so.
you are the exception.
Because you just can't get away with something like that without looking totally dissociated from the people who are playing your game. And Mike went through much ridicule for having expressed it. This might be the goal, but it's absolutely not the case. And people, specifically people who play a lot of Guild Wars 2, definitely do tunnel vision their way into individual game modes. It's led to a situation that's been kind of disastrous, with players lashing out at the successes of the game modes that they don't play, rather than applauding them when they do well. This is why I remark that it feels like a curse. It sort of doesn't matter how amazing Guild Wars 2's PvE Living World updates are, when a significant portion of the installed World vs World and PvP user base are there to snarl at it and continue proclaiming that Guild Wars 2 is somehow a bad game. Worse, when PvP has experienced some modicum of success during the Heart of Thorns days, something it really needs to start snowballing upwards, a big system refinement or tournament for example, it's nearly always getting stamped down on by huge numbers of PvE players that get a slight rush by typing esports lol in Twitch chat. People often cite raids as something that fragmented the community, but if that's true, then at least it was just the PvE community. There's a much more fundamental split in Guild Wars 2, and it's this. And if anything, during Heart of Thorns, that split is only solidified. What's interesting though, is that the lack of Guild Wars 2's World vs World or PvP success is not for a total lack of trying. There have been a plethora of updates to both, especially PvP, that we can look at over the year and see how they did. So without further ado, here's how I felt about these aspects of the game and how they measure up. Starting with PvP, which I've actually played quite a lot of. The first thing to talk about with Heart of Thorns PvP is something I can almost guarantee isn't on your mind right now, and that's because, like Masteries or Guild Halls, it was kind of a flash in the pan and is now mostly forgotten, despite being advertised and predicted as something exceptional. And that's the new game mode, Stronghold.
Despite the successes of competitive PvP, we feel like there's a lot of room for that to grow and become even more exciting. And so, we're going to be introducing to competitive PvP a brand new game mode called Stronghold.
Stronghold was to be both a new PvP map and, for the first time, not counting the Deathmatch Arena Courtyard, ArenaNet's first attempt at a new competitive game type altogether. See, until Heart of Thorns, Guild Wars 2 had only ever offered players Conquest as its competitive format. Conquest is a battle over 3 capture nodes and map territory, while Stronghold was to be a base assault format. A full discussion on Conquest is probably warranted elsewhere, like a review of the core game instead of its expansion, but suffice it to say that Conquest is not perfect. Particularly, many players, myself included, never felt that Conquest is very spectatable. So maybe it was for this reason, plus many others, Heart of Thorns was offering Stronghold as something new. But it was a complicated proposal immediately. One of the biggest problems off the bat was ArenaNet's lack of clarity over what the hell they were doing with Stronghold. As I mentioned before, both players and developers were more than familiar with the damage caused by having too many game types from our experiences in Guild Wars 1. And it wasn't like Guild Wars 2 was suddenly going to become highly competitive as a game where people play both Stronghold and Conquest, was it? So what was the priority game type meant to be? The thing from 2012, which hadn't quite worked out yet, but had some redeeming qualities and an installed audience familiar with it, or this new base assault format? The devs always waffled on their answer to this. I myself asked them about this in an interview back in February of 2015 and never gleaned a satisfying response. The company line was that they would see what the community takes to and support it. I think this was a huge mistake. It's too indecisive and it's not enough. At the time, the player base knew there'd be upcoming PvP tournaments and LANs with substantial prize pools, but if those were going to continue being Conquest, as they always were, then obviously people wouldn't be wasting their time practicing in Stronghold. Bluntly, the developers didn't seem to take Stronghold very seriously, so why should the player base? They didn't have any guts. What I wanted more than anything else was to hear ArenaNet say, yes, we think Stronghold is more spectatable and straight up better, so we're going to push it hard. Please do give it a real shot and let us hear your feedback. They didn't have to delete Conquest or anything, and if Conquest ended up genuinely the more fun experience, they could totally acquiesce to the community, but the default stance out of the gate should have been to have some real confidence. Then we would actually know if Stronghold had any legs because people would try it. That confidence wasn't evident. So instead, Stronghold released, no one really played it, and the devs ignored it. And I mean really ignored it. Stronghold was ultimately removed as a matchmaking option for competitive play entirely, and it's not something to think about anymore. A self-fulfilled prophecy. And how the hell could they have expected that to go any differently? Stronghold has looked more like a marketing gimmick to me than anything else now. The developers knew that nostalgia-hungry players were interested in a base assault game type resembling the first game's Guild versus Guild.
Now, Stronghold may sound a little familiar to some of you going back to the days of the original Guild Wars. It may sound a little bit like an evolution, maybe, of something that you once experienced.
They also knew a lot of people were into MOBA games like League of Legends, so they made a weird concoction of the two to pander to those demographics. Stronghold would never quite satisfy, but that's okay because it would market well. I'm not exactly a cynical person, but that's really how it looks. And it sucks because there seemed to be some real passion evident for Stronghold during those pre-release developer streams. Many people will point out that, in fact, some players were interested in Stronghold and did give great feedback about how to improve the game type, but that it all fell on deaf ears. And that's definitely a big part of this. A lot of changes weren't implemented, and I found myself screaming, why? Why did they make Stronghold? Why was this a part of Heart of Thorns if then it was going to be totally abandoned, even when some players did latch onto it? Did they only have one Stronghold dev and that dude just quit or something? What you should appreciate, dear viewer, is that Stronghold could have been a genuinely better format for Guild Wars 2, and by a long way, with more interesting roles, builds, and more tense match conclusions. But it was left to fester. What an absolute mess. I suppose the next question is now whether they'll bother to make another new game type with the next expansion, for marketing purposes, I guess. I think I'd laugh at that. My diatribe on Stronghold aside, there's actually still quite a lot to talk about when it comes to Heart of Thorns PvP. Heart of Thorns saw the introduction of seasons, real in-game ranking, leaderboards, new rewards, and progression. This feature, particularly after Season 5, has been amazing. The seasons are actually something that bought me a huge amount of Heart of Thorns playtime. I've probably spent more time playing PvP during the Heart of Thorns days than I have raiding, and raiding I consider to be a highlight of the expansion. I managed to secure several fairly high placements, including multiple legendaries and a platinum across the currently 6 seasons, and that means there's an enormous amount I could potentially go over. You could get an hour or more discussion on each of the different metas and matchmaking experiences on each season individually, so I'll spare going that far and just pick out the big bits. First, Season 1 was a mess, which is an incredibly unfortunate reality to live in, as it's where the system was under the most scrutiny. I don't think you'd find anyone who plays a lot of PvP who wouldn't confirm what I just said, and it's largely due to class balance and the meta of the time. Put plainly, the power creep, mainly from elite specializations, from blocks and defensive capabilities mainly, made the game incredibly slow and tanky. Season 1 was so slow-paced and so boring to both play and watch, it has set the developers on the warpath for making the game as deadly as possible ever since, doing things like removing large numbers of amulets from the game and sweeping balance alterations. And that's meant the rest of the seasons have been far more fun. I think we're unlikely to see as much defensive-oriented stuff in the Gen 2 elite specializations, purely as a result from the Season 1 experience. More broadly, Seasons 1 through 4 were not particularly great anyway, even once the metas were settling down, and this is due to the game's UI, rewards, and infrastructure regarding seasons. I'm not really sure what the ambition was, but at this time the idea of ranking up and being good at the game, of achieving legendary status, really had nothing to do with skill. It was an incredibly short-sighted implementation that was obvious from the get-go. Basically, all you had to do was play enough and then you'd be at the top, which totally spits in the face of what a skill-based competitive game and a system like Season should be. We had enormous amounts of average or even bad players who were being designated as the best players in the game, which of course rendered the whole thing meaningless. I myself absolutely am evidence of this. I'm a slightly above average PvPer with many games under my belt, but not deserving of the 3 legendaries and ruby ratings I got during this time. There was some positivity during Seasons 1 through 4, and it was a general step up for the PvP experience. One thing I very much enjoyed that started around this time was the implementation and refinement of new maps. Where Stronghold was left behind, yes, at least Conquest maps have been making their way in, and that's a big draw to many of us more casual PvPers who don't like seeing the same map over and over and over again. Heart of Thorns actually represents a period of the most new maps coming into PvP than any other point in Guild Wars 2's history, so it gets positive marks there. Further, the devs have legitimately listened to feedback on these maps, and they've been refining them and priming them for eventual ranked matchmaking, though some will feel that they're getting into ranked a little bit too slowly. And things only got better from Season 5 onwards. Much better. Season 5 and hopefully beyond is where things have all turned about. Season 5 is undisputably, in my opinion, the greatest period of PvP to have ever existed in Guild Wars 2. And this is coming from someone who played it relentlessly during the initial release days, when we had tournament tickets, a separate wardrobe, and it was little more than a beta, a period of time most people have no experience with. Season 5 gutted and remade what we saw in Seasons 1 through 4, adding real in-game leaderboards, exceptional rewards for even non-PvPers, and ensuring that only the top tiny percent, the best of the best, would actually get the highest ratings. So there was something to be really competitive about. Yes, it had some minor issues with Smurf accounts and hitches in the system that were later worked out, but these do not undermine how incredible Season 5 was for the PvP experience and population, which I'm positive was at an all-time high, even surpassing launch numbers outside of the first couple of weeks of 2012 release. We saw more PvP streamers trying the game out, higher viewership numbers, and an enormous amount of people in the PvP hub world, Heart of the Mists, and even hot joins. This video has been weighed down with a lot of criticisms, but let this ring loud and clear. Heart of Thorns did offer the best PvP Guild Wars 2 has ever seen during those Season 5 days. I stake my reputation on that claim. There are those who will disagree with this, citing too much visual noise from elite specializations, condition and boom spam, a lack of visual clarity to the combat, and more. And to those people, I absolutely agree with those issues, and I don't take them lightly. My favourite PvP combat is certainly from the first year of this game's release, and not the more recent, much harder to read Heart of Thorns stuff. But despite those problems, which you eventually acclimate to once you've played a bit, and is more of a balanced criticism than a PvP criticism, Season 5, its robust systems do immeasurable good. Early Guild Wars 2 combat might have had a certain charm and strength, but back then there was no infrastructure. It was a glorified beta and criminally unsupported. There was nothing even close to the matchmaking we now have, the rewards we now have, and everything else that arrived with Season 5, even if the rewards were a bit over-nerfed in Season 6. Before Season 5, in-game leaderboards were an ongoing meme for Guild Wars 2, with the developers relentlessly assuring us they'd arrive and then not doing it. Season 5 got stuff done that we had waited years for, and for that I applaud what the company finally accomplished. In many ways, how I feel about PvP is similar to what was happening with PvE and the awful content drought before everything turned around with Living World's return. PvP's been much the same. There is one last aspect to this story I'd like to bring up though, before we move on. It's very important, and it's not particularly good. That's the pro scene. What happened to me is just very unfortunate, and it's a great encapsulated example of something that has continually dogged on Guild Wars 2. Bad timing. Despite what I just said, that Guild Wars 2 has been at an all-time strength with its PvP for the average competitive player, there is no more sign of a pro scene, with many prominent teams having left for other titles. And the reason for this is very simple. It's not the metas, it's not the lack of player population, it's not some idea of slow matchmaking at the ultra high end, it's not even that ranked PvP is currently restricted to solo duo queue, though some will contest me on that last one. It's because ArenaNet stopped running LANs, offering prize pools, and communicating towards those. In many ways, I can see why they did this. As much fun as it probably was to offer such events for those really into Guild Wars 2 PvP, they just didn't drum up enough viewership or hype for the money that was being spent on them. There was some, sure, but likely not enough. And that's even after Heart of Thorns started advertising the existence of these streams on in-game loading screens. Let's not kid ourselves here. Interest in PvP LANs and tournaments, from a broader Guild Wars 2 perspective, and certainly a broader gaming perspective, was meager. ArenaNet had put the cart before the horse, and I don't say this laughing and with an air of superiority that I'm somehow above caring about Guild Wars 2 esports, as you often find online. I say this with disappointment. And what disappoints me most is that question of timing. Because if, when they finally worked out everything with Season 5, there was obvious LAN upcoming, which by this point there was no communication at all, and if there were the big tournaments, and if your average player did have the chance to make their own team during Season 5 and work towards something tangible, I think we absolutely could have seen Guild Wars 2 snowball into something greater. And I'll go you one further. If we had all of this stuff when we should have, right at the release of Heart of Thorns, when there was also the hype of the expansion, the odds are that Guild Wars 2 would have found a way bigger place. Or even one more, and it's painful to think about, what if this stuff, the LANs, the infrastructure, the meta, and the hype, were all there at launch, when they probably should have been? I'm not a big fan of saying too little too late. I still think Guild Wars 2 has ample opportunity to grow, but I can't help but look at this and shake my head. This stuff needed to land together at the same time, because the game is worth something. But in the end, by the time we got our horse in the right place, the cart is long gone. And that's a brief look at how PvP has gone for Heart of Thorns. Moving on from PvP, I'd like to round the video out talking about World vs. World, the third pillar of Guild Wars 2. I find World vs. World in particular something exceptionally difficult to talk about, largely in part due to the fact that I don't play much of it, but also because even the community itself seems to be incredibly conflicted on what they want. Where PvE players will band together, generally, and ask for new content to play, where PvP players will band together and ask for a pro scene, I find it hard to identify one significant unifying voice coming from World vs. World. It strikes me that depending on what you like, roaming or zerging, defending objectives or open field fights, sieging or pure profession combat, GVG or 1v1ing, asymmetry or perfect balance, and so much more, your opinions on what the game type needs are very specific and not often echoed by everyone else. It's exceptionally rare for me to find some piece of well-regarded, good World vs. World feedback, and even when something does get steam, there are often an enormous amount of detractors in the comments that cause it to lose some momentum. That lack of a unifying voice may have been what's led the developers to be so hesitant or misguided in their World vs. World updates over Guild Wars 2's life, or perhaps it's something else altogether. But I don't particularly feel comfortable speaking with authority about something like this either, when I'm only rank 600 or so. And so, don't hate me on this, but I'll keep it basic to inform people about what's happened and how it looks. And honestly, a lot of that basic stuff seems pretty good. But we need to begin with the big one, the Desert Borderlands, where PvP has had their new game type, World vs. Worlders were being offered a new Borderland. Unlike Stronghold, which released and was nearly entirely forgotten by most of us, the Desert Borderlands has actually seen a lot of play due to the fact that the World vs. World devs did have the guts to force it on people. This I have a lot of respect for, and nowadays the Desert Borderlands has seen plenty of updates and fits comfortably enough into the game type. It's not a perfect map though, and not by any stretch. That forcing I just talked about really caused some upset initially, as on release it really wasn't something many World vs. Worlders enjoyed at all. That's a big damn deal. Mostly, these problems come down to the fact that the Desert Borderlands are simply too large, and the layout of the map resulted in large groups not being able to fight each other for very long stretches of time. You'd essentially be running around for long periods of time in a big group, hungry for anything to kill at all. These are criticisms that the developers have been addressing, adding methods of faster movement through the map and retuning things. Some of these updates have been really important, but just look kind of small on a patch note. I've come to feel that the Desert Borderlands are a lot like scribing and other aspects of Guild Wars 2, in that updates and shifts since release have improved them substantially, but a lot of people haven't updated their opinions on them just yet. The Desert Borderland definitely still needs improvements, no doubt, but to suggest it had no worthwhile TLC at all, which I often do, is wrong. Beyond the Desert Borderlands, Heart of Thorns did also add another huge thing that affected World vs. World, and that was Squad UI. A comprehensive analysis of Squad UI is probably deserved in a video of its own if I'm being really honest, but it's worth mentioning here in passing at the very least. Squad UI is one of those things that you just accept as a part of the game nowadays, and can't imagine playing without, but it was a Heart of Thorns feature, and whenever we saw the developers talking to us about it, it was nearly always within a World vs. World context, where it's flourished. I like to imagine if Squad UI suddenly disappeared one day and seeing how incapable contemporary commanders would be at getting things done. It's like having one of your hands chopped off, or going back to the Dark Ages. And while I can't say whether Squad UI has truly facilitated the arrival of much more nuanced Zerg v Zerg fighting, it's undoubtedly been an enormous boon to World vs. World, and many other areas. There were also, as I alluded to in my guild review, various other new capabilities offered to players in Heart of Thorns. These were the tactics and the improvements. These systems actually were some of the most exciting things to me about the expansion. Calling in airships to strike Stone Mist Castle, rolling around in dune buggies, stealthing Zergs, or wielding insanely powerful banners. I think it's safe to say the art, at least, on these things is incredible. I'm always blown away at seeing a classic tower objective with a giant sentry scanning device mounted on top because of the new Heart of Thorns upgrades. How much this content affected the game type, though, is hard to address, and especially for me as someone who doesn't play it too much. But, as I mentioned before, several of these things were considered just too powerful at launch and had to be nerfed back over time, which means they do represent shake-ups, at least in some form or another. Beyond these headline features, Heart of Thorns also saw many other changes to World vs. World. There were the much needed downstate and death refinements, stopping people from resurrecting defeated allies while in combat, which changed the face of World vs. World Zerg fighting for the better. This isn't something that was advertised as a part of Heart of Thorns, but came in those updates and was dramatic. There were also changes to the scoring system and the arrival of skirmishes, the player population alterations with world linking, several new UI updates. As to the world linking, I think one of the most pointed differences between World vs. World in early 2012 versus Heart of Thorns World vs. World is that of a lack of server pride and community, as especially with world linking, much of that has evaporated to the population's lament. I think I'll have to leave World vs. World there, both due to my own ignorance on the topic and the length of this video. As with every episode of this review, I encourage you to check out my comments section and see what people are saying about it down there. Perhaps more than anywhere else, it's important to do that on this one, where I hope various embedded World vs. World players will be giving their own feedback on exactly how these various things have gone. So that is World vs. World and PvP, the two other huge cornerstones of Guild Wars 2. I really think the Heart of Thorns could have handled these two area of the games a little bit better, because over these months, I've sincerely begun to believe in what I said at the start of this video, that rather than this being a game that has 3 game types being some kind of perk, we're now looking at it as a detriment, and I don't think that's fair. I'd love to see the future expansions take those areas of the game more seriously and see more unifying positivity coming from further developments. But we'll have to see. Maybe Guild Wars 2 is destined to just go down the rabbit hole of being a mostly PvE game, and we'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Be sure to thumb up the opinions you agree with most down below, just so we can get the best feedback there. And join me next time for a roundup of several other features like adventures, break bars, and more, as we are nearing, at last, the end of the road. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.
We want to fundamentally change the way that World versus World works, so that when you battle so hard to take control of a major objective, if you fight for an hour to take Stone Mist Castle, keeping it should be important. Holding that objective should be a bigger part of victory in World versus World. So we're going to be making changes to the core World versus World experience, so holding objectives is a bigger part of victory across the board in all components of World versus World.
Oh yeah, what happened to that?